Hi, and now this is part 2 of chapter 2 in week 2, Family Sociology. And we're going to look now as really a lot more at the role of that diversity we see emerging in Canadian families. And let's focus now on their experience. Now, what's important here is that you keep your sociological imagination focused, looking at both the public and private experiences. So look at things from the point of view of the family and what might be affecting them inside in terms of the adoption or adaptation to Canadian society and their own personal issues. But then also look at the public issues and what might be some of the influences on families and what they have to learn and adjust and the pressures being brought to bear. And so this is an important beginning of the sociological imagination for you, is to get past your own personal experience and step back and sort of view this from the point of view of that family and what they might be experiencing being a new family in Canada and what would be the adjustments they need to make. And then also some of the other pressures and influences from the outside society. And that will be your challenge not just in this chapter, but also in subsequent chapters looking at family when it's not just about your own personal experience. A sociologist is about standing back and looking at things without the bias of our own experience and our own opinions. And so that is what part of the challenge is in sociology, and by subsequent, by relationship is family sociology. So let's give it a go and keep up with our work, and keep up the good work, everybody. We're going through this one chapter at a time. Thank you. Let's get started. Now, looking at the experience of immigrants in Canada, upon arrival, many immigrants live in ethnic neighborhoods. They're also known as enclaves that support cultural traditions. Now, some of the reasons for doing so is that you're around people that you're familiar with who hold and have come from backgrounds similar to your own, and oftentimes can give you the kind of support and help you need to get off the ground with your native tongue in a lot of cases. And they carry on some similar cultural experiences that enable them to feel comfortable upon first arrival. Cultural practices arouse condemnation if they violate mainstream Canadian values. Immigration can also mean separation from family members. And of course, you can only imagine that being separated from family because you left a country for whatever sort of reason, oftentimes it's because of persecution, in which case you've left the family in a very difficult spot, but you've come to Canada, and it makes it very challenging for immigrant families to deal with that. Female domestic workers often leave children when they come to Canada on temporary visas to care for Canadian children or seniors. Children of immigrants may have a difficult time growing up with two cultures. And we hear a lot about how that becomes very difficult for children born in Canada, or even if they're not, they adapt to cultural shifts sometimes more quickly than parents do. Many of the first missionaries and government officials saw Aboriginal customs as backwards, and they tried to wipe them out. And this is of the Aboriginal experience as opposed to visible minorities. One way was by taking children from their homes and educating them in residential schools where the children were isolated from their families and their culture. And this has been a big issue for quite some time, and we're noticing, in fact, a lot of the research that has been done has looked at what's been the experience of having that gap in cultural experience for many Aboriginal people. They're often subjected to harsh military-like regime in the schools, and many suffered emotional, physically, and sexual abuse. The schools cut them off from models of healthy family interactions, and so institutional graduates had few skills and little knowledge when it came to their own families. And so it's been a difficult time for some people who, in this case, are native people to Canada, adapting to some of the shifts and approaches of what the sort of public view or the pressures on families of Aboriginal families, and therefore how it is for them to deal with some of those things internally. We often look at them from afar as if to say, I can understand that circumstance, but until we've been there and lived that experience, we can't. And this is part of the challenge of the sociological imagination. Now, being different, is it acceptable? We can look at the issue of stigma, which is a tribute that is used to differentiate individuals, has a negative value. pointing somebody out and separating them out from a group, but doing so with the purpose of saying that this is less valuable. They're not as valuable, not as good as the cultural norm. Stigmas are not intrinsic attributes. Rather, they are socially constructed and acted upon. And what that means is there is no inferiority to any group. It's socially constructed, which means we've generalized. And that's what that at the bottom right-hand corner is representing, is that as soon as we start to label people, we start to stereotype and we divide them between us and them. And that creates this loss of social status and enables discrimination to occur. Prejudice is the thought of people being inferior. Discrimination is acting on those thoughts. In much of Canada, social acceptability is based on being white, middle class, and male. Relies on the values that come from this British and Christian heritage in the background. Discrimination based on a majority value can profoundly affect the family life of minority group members. Now, in theory, Canada values acceptance and embraces diversity, yet in practice, many groups of immigrants have experienced prejudice and discrimination. And I think if you are on Twitter, if you're in social media, if you've read news reports, even if you're just walking around in some social environments, you may have heard people's feelings about Canada accepting 25,000 Syrian refugees. And that's an example where, as a value in Canada, we embrace diversity. We are a country that celebrates multiculturalism. However, if you ask people who are themselves immigrants, have they experienced something less than acceptance, many of them would argue, or at least be able to acknowledge that yes, they have. Now, when we look at the degree of stigma attached to a particular behavior or status, it sometimes changes over time. Members of minorities are often stigmatized by the majority. Central to the discussion of immigrants is the majority sense of superiority, the notion that this way is the right way and any other way is wrong or not, or is at best inferior. Looking at cultural celebrations and saying, well, that's not the way you do it our way, is an example of stigmatizing and acting on that stigmatizing based on a majority sense of that what we do is right and more superior. Since the family is at the heart of society, differences in family patterns seem as a threat to society itself. That people don't dress, act, behave, or celebrate in the same way seems somehow to some people to be a threat to society. Sense of superiority and fear that is what is valued most will be destroyed, provokes the most violent forms of this sort of belief in that we are superior because we are the majority is what gives this sense of entitlement, and that does tend to provoke more violent forms of prejudice. Now, violent forms of prejudice is sort of a misnomer. Prejudice is an attitude in your head. Discrimination is the action that you take. Now, when we look at in Canada in terms of policy, we can look at four main responses to minority status, which are called aculturalization strategies. Psychological and behavioral changes in individuals as a result of migration. One of them is separation, assimilation, integration, and marginalization. Now, aculturalization strategies located on two dimensions. If you look at it as a line, and on one end there's acceptance, and on the other end there's rejection of the new or the old culture. So there's these options, if you will, run on a continuum. Separation, this strategy is based on voluntary rejection of a dominant culture or involuntary exclusion from the dominant culture. Collective versus individual strategies. It can occur by choice or forced on by a particular group. Now, for example, Muslims have emphasized their Islamic identity in the face of discrimination following the September 11th, 2001 incident of terrorist attack, that they started to be separated from others by being of a similar background as some people who had been involved in terrorist acts, as if to say, well, of all people, are all the same when they are of this ethnicity. And that would be an example of separation, whereas assimilation is based on rejection of heritage culture, may be voluntary or forced, and it's a form of passing. Passing is dressing, acting, and behaving as if you were like the dominant culture. It's not that you're just necessarily throwing aside your own cultural background, but you're trying to be accepted, so you dress, act, and behave like others. That's what is called passing, trying to hide membership in a minority group. The example here is immigrants from India who opt to choose their own marriage partners instead of agreeing to arranged marriages. Because in many parts of India, that is a part of the process of marriages arranged. Assimilation or passing would be to be able to act more Canadian, if you will. Integration, well, this is when high levels of engagement in both the heritage and the mainstream cultures are sought. So most adaptive pathway because it implies bicultural competence. Bicultural competence means you accept both elements, Canadian and your background culture, and you blend them. It's more flexible. Example is the hyphenated Canadian, like the Polish Canadian. You're identifying both as being part of your culture. And then lastly is marginalization, when little possibility or interest in maintaining heritage culture or little interest in having relations with others in a dominant culture, it's often associated with appearance of dysfunctional and deviant behavior. People who are marginalized because of different cultural backgrounds are often experienced because of their being marginalized, delinquent, substance abuse, family abuse. In many instances, we've seen examples of Aboriginal families being marginalized. It could be argued, and is argued, that the missing Aboriginal women is an example of marginalization of Aboriginal women. In that if my sister was missing and I'm not found and suspected of being murdered, that there would be more action to solve that issue than there is for Aboriginal women. Okay, we can now look at as well now some of the differences in terms of acculturalization policies, strategies for integrating or excluding immigrants that are promoted or enforced by the dominant group. And this can be done by both government at different levels, federal, provincial, municipal, through laws or other official programs. And we can see multiculturalism, melting pot, segregation, and exclusion. Multiculturalism, these are policies that accept diversity and includes all ethnic and cultural groups. And this was initially a part of policy back in the 80s under Prime Minister Trudeau, Justin's father. Melting pot, this is policies that encourage individuals to assimilate into the dominant culture. And the US has often been called a melting pot. And this is where it doesn't matter where you come from, you try to become American. And then segregation is a polity based on forced separation from the dominant group. And so if you don't comply or don't fit, then you are segregated from. And we've seen this as being a part of some of the Aboriginal experience. In our history, in the beginning of the 20th century, we saw this with Chinese, with Japanese, as being here to work but not involved in any other elements and being segregated from some other elements. And then exclusion, policies that marginalized immigrants are excluded and not included in things deliberately and in no uncertain terms excluded. Now on this particular graph you're seeing the difference between minority and dominant culture, and where does these acculturalization policies on the accept or reject. So for example, multiculturalism is accepted by both the minority and dominant culture, and that's what would be multiculturalism, that both groups are accepting. Whereas the melting pot, the dominant culture accepts that, but the minority group's culture, it doesn't. It likes to maintain some of its own heritage, and yet it can't in a melting pot. So that's kind of what that graph means there. And then lastly, again, when we look at some of the differences in the family, in the study of the family, and why is it important to be aware of differences between families, you can list the areas in which you consider yourself part of a minority. Have you experienced any discrimination because of this? In what ways might this experience help or hinder as you interact with others? That we all are a part of some degree of a minority experience in some capacity and some more than others. So why is it important that we be aware of differences between family? Well, differences are not equal in terms of inferiority. All individuals are shaped by a family and cultural heritage, the wider social context and past experience. So Canadian population is becoming more diverse all the time. So difference does not equal inferiority. Difference can be accepted and received well because we all have differences. And so, because I'm older doesn't make me inferior. Because someone else is a woman doesn't make her inferior. Those differences don't equal inferiority. Growing invisible minority population is challenging governments and communities to remove barriers to equitable participation in social and economic life. We will all be affected by changes resulting from pressure for equal rights. And so I think it's worth doing this exploration in order for us to become more aware and better able to cope with the changes that are going to be continued. Accepting diversity because we are ourselves diverse. I hope this has been helpful. Please put some thought into it because it's something that we do think about, and sometimes not always from a sociological imagination point of view. There's your challenge. Thank you, everybody.